Hello everyone, so I wanted to give like an editing disclaimer here. So most of this video is taken from footage that my brother shot for me and he did a really good job on that. What's missing is stuff I cut out because it just didn't go with the flow very well. I've also introduced some supplementals that I put together since we did this video project because we did it many months ago and I'm just now actually looking at getting it done. I apologize where the edits are a bit rough here, and I'm going to probably have a lot of pictures inserted, just because that's kind of how I'm used to. I much prefer being on the other side of the camera. Again, I want to stress the shots my brother took and everything like that. They were amazing, and I thank him very much for it.
Alright, Steven's interview, both Tascam and camcorder recording. Here we go.
Well, my name is Stephen Valbrandon Jr. I'm almost 40 years old. I actually come from the state of Georgia, but I've lived in Michigan so long, I consider myself a Wolverine. I'm a bit of a scholar, got an education, master's degree from Michigan State University, and also was a member of the United States Navy, where for the most of my enlistment, I worked operational intelligence. My military career really isn't all that much, save for the fact that I so happened to have listed at the time where there was a counterinsurgency push initiated by Petraeus. That's the coin-op you heard of. And so I found myself a man who enlisted in the Navy and was initially stationed on a ship in the middle of the desert, specifically Tikrit, Iraq, which is Saddam Hussein's hometown. And a lot of people don't know this. That is also where Saladin is from. Saladin being the guy who was sort of the counter-crusader in much of history in Jerusalem. And so I actually got to do some interesting things in the global war on terrorism. And then I went back to Japan where I had to deploy almost immediately after I got back from Iraq because there was an insurgency movement, and there may still be an insurgency movement within the Philippines, and that's actually, it's no joke what was going on over there, certainly. And then it's funny, I had kind of joked that I chased headlines unintentionally because I was patrolling off of Korea when North Korea did their first nuclear bomb test. And then, of course, I was part of the counterinsurgency operations. So I thought I would finish up at an unheard of post that nobody will probably know about in Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. And I got out and stuff like that. And then used my GI Bill to, get a degree in IT and then get a master's from Michigan State University. And it was actually while I was at Eastern that I, became very knowledgeable and was introduced to human trafficking.
Discuss a little bit about the work that you did in human trafficking.
The work that I did in human trafficking, well, essentially the work that I did in human trafficking was I was introduced to it via a gentleman named David Manville. I was knowledgeable about human trafficking and what it was in modern day slavery, sometime around 2004, 2005. It was when I met David Manville, who is a social worker here in Michigan. And I mean, the man's been he was a social worker for like 3 or 4 decades. You name the vice, he knows it, he's processed it, and he's helped survivors and everything like that. And then when I got involved, though, I noticed that there was a lot of people who wanted to paint signs and yell at police that they weren't doing enough, but there seemed to be very little effort concentrated on actual really good research. And that's when somebody suggested to me, a good friend of mine, Harry, that you should really bring the spirit and sort of zest to counter-terrorist operations as you bring to looking at how human trafficking is. After all, terrorists are for the most part criminals, and human trafficking is a crime. So there's demand, there's supply, there's physical locations that are being kept. Somebody has to have a count of those physical locations and such like that. And that's really kind of where I brought a style that I think a lot of people didn't bring, which is to be a hybrid of sort of the analytical side of things, but also the investigative side of things.
Okay. Can you discuss a little bit about some of the hindrances you've had in terms of investigating in your work?
Well, most of the hindrance is that it just doesn't catch on. Frankly, the average person who enters the modern day abolitionist cause is going to be in their late teens, early 20s. They don't really so much care about getting anything done as they really care about people thinking they care. It's for the most part now a social media trend. They don't want to do a lot of heavy scholarship or things like that. It's just not cool for a lot of them.
Okay. Interesting. Can you talk about some of the higher profile cases you've been involved in?
Oh yeah, gladly, because everything I do via what's called open source intelligence. I've never had to con anybody, lie to anybody, or break into anything to do things. Probably one of the more high profile things I did was investigating a ring that I was told was operating out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I kind of got lucky / kind of made my own luck in that, because I was talking about methodologies I used to figure out if there's a human trafficking site. And I was actually in Grand Rapids for a hacker thing, mostly. Cyber defense competition. And somebody told me that they had worked at a place there that was masquerading as a physical fitness place. But when they went there as a part of a service team, maintenance on the pipes and everything, they found out there was very little equipment whatsoever, and a lot of private rooms, and the source of the clogging, they said, was condoms being flushed down the toilet. And so that's how I got to my first thing, and I put together a report on that establishment. It was a 20-something report about the person who currently ran it, and that person, I found out, was actually in federal prison for quite a while because they operated a cocaine smuggling ring. Got out, and apparently we're now doing a human trafficking ring. I got like a 20 hours later, after submitting that report to Polaris, which is a non-profit, though a federally funded non-profit. They're like the main group you'll have to deal with when you're in human trafficking. I submitted it to them, and 20 hours later the FBI called me, which, to get a response like that from the FBI, that is actually quite a very big deal. And it was funny because the FBI was sort of thought the same thing, like, how did you get this data? Is this open source? And I spent basically 5 minutes repeating myself that, yes, I got this through open source intelligence. They were suspicious that somebody could get as far as I did and collect the data I did by just going to chat rooms, looking at websites that were dominated by user-generated content and whatnot. And so that was pretty much the start of it. And from there on out, I did a few more projects with some people. A big deal with me, though, came when I just explained my methodology to a Department of Homeland Security agent, and he was able to use that to gather the information he needed on a human intelligence trafficking operation in 11 days, which is a very quick turnaround. I mean, investigations on the federal level, they can take years. So that was really what I wanted to do. Anybody can go look at a city and say, there's human trafficking in Cleveland. There's human trafficking in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Well, duh, okay, you said where there's people, there's going to be crime, and now you think you're a genius. But can you come up with a methodology that makes things more specific? That was kind of my mission. I'd say I accomplished it.
Can you discuss sort of some of the problems that have, or I guess when you started to get suspicious that there might be falsehoods within the vein of people who are advocating for human trafficking?
Well, Sean, I'd say basically, when did I start becoming knowledgeable that there were organizations and people out there spewing false information? And the answer pretty much has to be right away. I just knew that some of them had to have been lying about their operational effectiveness, because of just what I've seen on the ground of how hard this is and how difficult it is. So you'd have people claiming to, I have a 100% recovery rate when I'm tracking down missing children. That's just not a thing. If it was, you would know that person. Every agency on earth would know that person, and you would find them. I was also seeing the rise of completely false statistics as well. Like one of them is, the averaging age of a human trafficking victim is like 10 to 14 or whatever. Like, that's not arranged. So you do some hunting down to find out if there's any credible source. Like, did you lift this number from a journal or what? And oftentimes you would find out that people would just get stuff from a website. If they saw it on the internet and they saw that number must be real to them. And then you notice sometimes a number would get debunked only to later be used again for something completely different. So I sort of got hip to that right away. And also too, there's what I call the SWAT story, which is kind of a story that a lot of people in the human trafficking community tell, because I don't let a lot of them know of my background, but my dad was like a career criminal justice official in Michigan. My uncle himself was a veteran police officer. So when you sort of try to lie to me about how the way police go about something, it's not a very good idea. And I've noticed that a lot of these would say, I have to keep Officer so-and-so's name secret, but they'd say that, well, I met with a grieving family and within a couple minutes I was able to figure out where their daughter was, which that's suspect. But you'd go to these conferences, they would do that, and here's the kicker though, they would say that, well, I notified dispatch and I reported that they had a human trafficking victim in their city. And this is because I've reported it before, and the person on the other end of that phone gets a lot of calls per day, and honestly their job is to basically smash you down. Did you actually see it happening? What did the person look like? They're not very kind to you because only 1 out of something like 39 calls for Polaris pans out to be anything worth investigating. And so, but miraculously, they would get a dispatcher who knew what they were doing. And what's very interesting is, a lot of them would go, now you're probably not going to believe me when they're in front of an audience. And I don't believe in psychics, but I kind of do because I never believed what followed. They'd say that, well, the SWAT team was en route. The SWAT team commander made it a point to contact them and tell them about the target they were going to hit. No, that's a lie. A SWAT team commander is not going to reach out to a civilian in another state who he's never met and actually talk to them about how they're going to go on a raid or serve a warrant or do whatever they do. That's completely unrealistic. It's completely made up. It tells me basically that you've got all your information from media culture you've absorbed. And you can talk to police if you want, but that's never how it would go down. So that right alone got me to observing that. And then of course in the most recent case you have Operation Underground Railroad, which claims to liberate 700 people per year from sex slavery. That's 2 per day. That's not happening. And now Tim Ballard is actually being officially prosecuted by his state's attorney general.
Can you discuss who that is?
Tim Ballard is a man who led an anti-human trafficking nonprofit. I think he still leads it, called Operation Underground Railroad. Tim Ballard's background is very confusing because he changes it. Initially, when he bursted on the scene, he told people he was a CIA person who specialized in human trafficking. But then as his charity got a bit bigger, he switched and said he was from the Department of Homeland Security. And he's made some claims and such that pretty much are panning out to be false. He also put out some YouTube videos supposedly of his raids. And if you're somebody who knows violence or even knows a little bit of how to handle weapons or martial arts, it's very clear that everything he's showing us is staged. You can look at his videos if you want. It's pretty obvious he's lying.
Kind of the big piece was this woman, I think you said Theresa Flores was her name. You want to discuss a little bit about the circumstances surrounding how that all came to light and whatnot?
Okay, so Theresa Flores, so who is Theresa Flores? That question alone is kind of a heavy one. Because for years that was just essentially a stage name. It's now my understanding that particular woman has filed the correct paperwork with the state of Ohio to have their name officially changed to Theresa Flores. I forget what initial name they had their social worker's license under. But Theresa Flores is this person who touted themselves as an expert on human trafficking. Now, it's my understanding that they do have a graduate level degree in social work or a related field. As far as their expertise, and this is very important because various lawmakers, legislators, and elected officials have used this woman as their base of advice on drafting legislation, was that she herself was a human trafficking victim, and that this occurred in the state of Michigan for about 2 years, from 1980 to 1982, with some conflicting statements about where in Michigan it happened. When you look at her book, her reissue of her book, and some of the stuff she puts forth in various interviews, you can never really pin down where in Michigan this happened to her. So I want to direct people's attention to this sentence right here. Because remember, this person claims they lived in Birmingham. Just one street separated Birmingham from Southfield. Just one street. Let me point to it. Yeah, it starts right there. Just one street separated Birmingham from Southfield. The slave across the street, Theresa Flores, states that, and I'm going to quote, "Just one street separated Birmingham from Southfield. This is a lie. Here is Southfield, here is Birmingham, and in between is Beverly Hills on this side, and then Royal Oak on the other side." You can see these right here. I'm going to click on the map. All right. And then you've got Beverly Hills. And then you've got further down Southfield. So, in other words, this is one of her many lies. And they'll make the claim of, well, I lived in this portion of the city that bordered Southfield, but you pull up a map and no portion of that city bordered Southfield. So it really gets dicey. But according to her, what had happened was she was drugged, her clothing was removed, pictures of her were taken by a high school Chaldean mafia group that used nunchucks. This is all in her own median book, her books are very graphically racist. The woman really wears her white nationalism on her arm. So what they said was they would give her pictures back basically if she worked for this Chaldean gang, and which, first of all, that's called extortion, not trafficking. I'm not saying that either is acceptable, but that's not human trafficking, that's extortion. She had the option of allowing them to release the photos if any of this happened, which, again, I don't think it did, particularly because the high school that she mentions attending in Michigan, there is no high school with that particular name. In various written communications, she has claimed it was a copy and paste error in her book, but some people have pointed out that in her speeches she gives the erroneous name of the high school, which again never existed. Groves High School is the name given in the book. She did not go to Grove High School because it doesn't exist. However, I was able to get a photo from a yearbook that would imply that she went to Wiley E. Groves High School. Now, aside from that, there's a lot of very weird timeline issues. She claims this happened for 2 years. She claims she had to sneak out of her room at night, was gone for several hours, sometimes servicing as many as 30 clients. Now, again, there's inconsistencies in her books versus her speeches about where this took place and what nights, but it doesn't seem to really make any sense that this could be sustained and her parents and her school officials not really know about it. It also seems to me to be completely unbelievable the level of counterintelligence sophistication that this mob employs, given the fact that they're teenagers. You're just not that smart, not at your top of your game when you're a teenager. And if you read the books, the whole, we know all the movements of where you are, we know the movements of your parents and where they are. I'm sorry, I don't buy that high schoolers could put together an organized crime ring that sophisticated. But nevertheless, And I was actually kind of introduced to her and her organization in 2014. Some state senators here in Michigan, used her to draft what they call the Theresa Flores laws. And this is problematic because it seems nobody vetted her. And they encouraged to give to her organization, which they said was saving our adolescents from prostitution. Now, I don't contribute to any charity unless I can pull their paperwork from the state and from the IRS, because there's filings 1023s, 1024s, and that's with the IRS. But then on the local level, there's the registry, which happens with the Secretary of State in 49 states in the Union. Michigan actually is a weird one. Our Secretary of State handles basically nothing the other Secretaries of State handle. We're very unique. Licensing and regulatory affairs, abbreviated for obvious reasons, for people who know this business intelligence stuff, LARA. When you kind of pull filings, we'll be spending a lot of time with LARA is what some of us like to joke about. And essentially there was no charity. It was all smoke and mirrors. So this is a screenshot of part of the response I get. I have actually made a formal strike on Theresa Flores's license. That's her license to be a social worker in the state of Ohio, based off of the fact that I know she's actually defrauded people out of their money. Now, this video is going to be about the specific organization, S.O.A.P, S.O.A.P, Saving Our Adolescents from Prostitution. And I had heard about this organization quite a while back. And honestly, when I checked it out, I couldn't find anything with the state of Ohio and nothing registered with the federal government. So here's a timeline briefly that's going to just cover that. So first I started hearing about it, like I said, it was many years ago, but I pulled some paperwork and publications I looked up. Now, here, interestingly enough, we see something she did with Oakland Press, and it happened in 2014. Now, this has some contradictory information that doesn't match up with her books, and I'm going to actually get it's books plural because she released 2 books about her experience, even though those books have contradictions in them. So, first you can see that, she said people broke into her house, which is definitely not what happened in her book. Kidnapped from her Birmingham home. Doesn't happen in her book. And it also mentions her parents knowing about it and saying she packed up and moved to Ohio. In the book, she actually moves to the East Coast. So that's 2014. And there's actually another reference to it here, because there was a meeting where these politicians started talking about the project or the organization. And it's the first thing I heard of when I got involved in counter-human trafficking is, what are you going to do for this woman down in Ohio and all that? Well, I'm not going to do anything. I don't live in Ohio. Michigan has plenty of its own problems. And here both politicians mentioned it. So by 2014, she was collecting money for an organization that doesn't seem to have actually existed. Now here's the timelines with that. We don't have anything registered to the state of Ohio until 2015. And we don't have anything on the IRS registry until 2016. So what happens to that year of revenue, so to speak? It doesn't exactly make very much sense. And like I said, this is pretty much why I believe she's a fraud, and why I'm taking action against her. They did have a website, but it appeared just a website. Now, the website itself had a bunch of false claims on there, a bunch of phony, made-up statistics that it couldn't really back on human trafficking. But it seemed that a lot of people just believed it because, hey, it's on a website. Now, one of the things they said was, on their website, they claimed to have been a direct rescue organization and having rescued multiple children. Well, when you delve down into it, though, and if you even contacted the supposed people, no, we don't do that. It's on their website that they do, but they don't do that. What they did apparently is you give them money and they'll give you bars of soap, and you can put those in women's restrooms, and they have the human trafficking hotline on there. She says that because apparently human traffickers won't follow the people they're trafficking into restrooms. It doesn't exactly make sense, but like you said, I knew from the go that a lot of this never made any sense. So I was like, okay, clearly this woman is a fraud. I mean, you take money from people for a charity that doesn't exist, you're a fraud. I don't care what you do with the money afterwards. You could spend it on a yacht, or you could do, maybe you could do something actually good with that money, but if you are taking money under false pretenses, that's you being a fraud. So I thought to myself, okay, so she's a fraud with the finances, but that led me to look more directly into her actual story. And that's what kind of got me on this whole project of basically tugging at one thread, that coming apart. Okay, well, tug on another thread, because at the point I found out she was a fraud, what you need to understand is my thought was, okay, you lied about representing a charity. You took people's money, but there's kind of this thought of, if you're the type of person who's going to just sign a $5,000 check over to someone and you're not going to vet them, I mean, how sorry for you should I really feel? Now, one of my friends has pointed out that that's an absolute crap statement. What about people who are maybe mentally feeble? They can't think, elderly people and such like that. You can really take them for a row. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, you should have thought on your feet and really looked into this. And that's about really all I can say in regards to that. And I think that kind of brings us to the modern thing of, why has it ran amok to the state it has run amok to? Where, you now have what used to be fringe conspiracy theories, at least two really fringe ideas that are now mainstream. And that is, of course, just accusing businesses out of the blue of, trafficking children, even though that can't be proved. Now there's the adrenochrome theory, which, seems to be gathering steam and is more popular. Another thing that people don't know about Theresa Flores is she was the one who popularized this idea that a lot of politicians are now onto about, if a woman is being raped, it's not consensual sex, and the body will shut that down, therefore women who are raped can't get pregnant. That actually originated in the re-edition of her book called The Slave Across the Street, which, again, it's unsupported. There seems to be no literature out there that agrees with that. There seems to be no council of OBGYNs who have signed off on that. She literally just said that as a fact because she was trafficked in her own opinion and never got pregnant. So the pictures that are behind me, what are they signifying? So when I set forth to do this research, it's important I set out to just find out if the materials presented to me were factual. And so a timeline really helped, because one of the things that has kind of, I think, ruined the cause a little bit is that it's become a short way to have cash thrown at you. Found a anti-human trafficking nonprofit. Say you liberated 38 people last month from sex slavery, and you can get a lot of grants. Now, you may have done none of that, but still, who's going to turn down $100,000? So, behind me is kind of a general timeline, right? And it begins, and what I did was I used Amazon ratings. Now, the first thing I mentioned is the book Disposable People, which is a good scholastic work about human trafficking. Gets into, actual human trafficking, which is sort of transportation of people, forced transportation of people, usually for labor, or sort of what we call change of sceneries. That's where, somebody's knocked out or abducted and just driven a couple hundred miles into a location they know nothing about, and hey, you got chopped down so many of these trees, or you are not going to get back home. And that book sold well within the thing. And then I found out, of course, that the book that Theresa Flores had done, The Slave Across the Street, was initially titled The Sacred Bath. And it was put out, and it, has a few reviews, but you get the sense that it didn't exactly sell like wildfire. Now, what's really interesting to me is I wanted to see how the impact of the movie Taken had on that. Because, it's kind of like you can't talk about people's perception of sharks without talking about the Jaws movies. You cannot talk about what people think of human trafficking when, without talking about the movie Taken. It was wildly popular. So right after that happens, there's a book released called The Slave Next Door, which is about a guy who kind of did a freelance investigation into a place that had a lot of young female domestic servants and found out about human trafficking. And then what's very interesting is Theresa Flores comes out with another book, now titled The Slave Across the Street, which I thought that was very funny. To me, it's sort of somebody glomming on to something to boost the sales of their book. And I finally read that book just recently, and man, it is chock full of a lot of racism. I mean, that alone should get this woman barred from a lot of organizations and whatnot. So the timeline really helped. Now I included in this stuff behind me. I think there's some thought of, well, what's the harm of misinformation? Well, I have two very high profile incidents. Well, one's not really that high profile, unfortunately. But I have what happened at Comet Pizza. Now, for those people not familiar with Pizzagate and Comet Ping Pong and what happened. Essentially, a business just out of nowhere was accused by several far-right media outlets of engaging in human trafficking. I believe the name linked to that, they said that was where Podesta was picking up underage children for sex. This had absolutely no truth to it whatsoever. It was just made up. But what happened was very real, which is a man went in and shot the place up. Now, thank God, nobody was hurt. But even seeing recent interviews of those people, they were traumatized, and rightfully so. I mean, they just came to work, they were working pizza, they were playing ping pong, and you had people like Jake Posobiec going online and on the media and testifying that he saw secret entrances and stuff like that. And, unfortunately, there seems to be really no punishment mechanism for this stuff. I mean, other than libel and slander laws, which weren't meant to reflect social media. But then there was a more recent incident that happened involving an unfortunate person named Aaron Sorensen. Aaron Sorensen was accused of being a human trafficker. Now, this accusation was out of the blue. Aaron Sorensen was 19 years old. I think he might have even actually been younger than that when he actually died. He was abducted, he was brutally tortured, and he was murdered for human trafficking. The police have cleared his name. But the person who did that tortured and offed a person who was barely mentally capable. I mean, he had an IQ of 80, and they just murdered him brutally on accusation alone. And what's even sick about that is this Eisenman, I think, was the person who killed Aaron Sorensen, John Eisenman. I can show you some stuff on social media. The man became an overnight hero because he had offed a human trafficker with nobody asking the question. First of all, people who get involved in human trafficking, that's a fairly high-level crime. You usually have something on paper, It's not you bumped into a guy at, Trader Joe's and be like, how's that job as a Pilates coach? It didn't work out, so I became a human trafficker. A 19-year-old that just didn't make any sense to me. But like I said, there were online campaigns and charities to raise money for him. There was Larry Lawton, who's a YouTube channel I follow, basically talked about how the guy's a folk hero for taking out this trafficker. And it's like, first of all, vigilante justice shouldn't really be a thing for this very reason, Justice can't be done here because no matter how long John Eisenman is sent away, some family lost their teenage son and is not getting him back. And these are just the high-profile incidences we know. Now, there are some other ones out there that are a little bit less minor when Wayshare, or I forget the name, Wayshare, Waypoint, a furniture company was accused of kidnapping children and selling them through their website. Now that was easily debunked, but I mean that company suffered financially for that. Sponsors definitely wanted to pull out. The stock plunged. Now they're still operating, but this is real harm that's being done to people at this point. Whereas I could maybe say, hey, you signed away your $5,000. I can't really say it's harmless anymore.
I didn't know that story.
Unfortunately, nobody does know that story. And I'll tell you why, because it blew up. Vigilante takes out human trafficker. And the sort of truth of it came out many weeks later, or many months later. And so it just wasn't hot news. The only people who know that are probably people who live in Spokane, Washington.
Theresa Flores, you mentioned that her book is pretty flamingly racist. Is there any specifics that you can get into about the book?
Oh, well, she says she lived in the area of Michigan that was high in foreign-born percentages of people in the city of Birmingham, which to me just seems weird. But all throughout it, she describes how people who aren't Americans smell weird. At one point in time, she talks about how, everything is, I was out with a Jewish person of this and this, and I was out with a tough Irish person of that, and I was worried about this Italian stabbing somebody. She makes all of Michigan basically out to be this ghetto, dystopian, ethnic cesspool, which in and of itself is pretty offensive. Probably the thing, though, that stands out the weirdest is where she sees a gang fighting, and one of her friends comes up to her and explains what's happening. And at one point they say, okay, the people wielding the nunchucks are Arabs because that's what Arab boys use. I have not had this confirmed with any sources I know of. First of all, it's not actually a weapon you'd use on the streets. It's a segmented weapon, extremely hard to keep hold of in a street fight. You almost knock yourself out just practicing with it. So the idea that there's Arabs roaming around Michigan with nunchucks terrorizing people, it's just pure fiction. But other than that, yeah, pretty much the only people who are good in Theresa Flores' book are the whites. And there's even passages of her describing dark people walking past her and her being scared. It is very blatantly racist. And like I said, to see politicians posing next to her, the only book that I can think of that I read that's more overtly racist would be the Turner Diaries. For God's sakes. And how do politicians not read and vet their sources of information? This is just bizarre to me. I get maybe if this was happening 30 years ago, but she's risen to prominence now. You just need the internet now to sort of match up, okay, she's lying about where she lived in Michigan. She's lying about her organization. Now, many years after, she did officially file the paperwork with the IRS and Secretary of State in Ohio. But for years, though, she just collected money for an organization that did exist. Like, how do politicians do this? I really am, because they have people who study for them.